Hi everyone, this is lesson 6 on the truths on Eden. Today we're talking about the tabernacle, or temple, itself as a pattern of the model of redemption. So, I guess not a review from last week, I missed that slide. But here, diving into this class, we have 4 temples of Jerusalem. We have the Tabernacle of Moses, we have Solomon's temple, Zerubbabel's temple, and Herod's temple. And we're going to be talking about how each of them, mostly the Tabernacle of Moses is where we spend a lot of time in on, but we're going to be going through a history of each of these and why they are models of the path of redemption back to God. So let's talk about the Tabernacle of Moses and all of the kind of different angles, paradigms that we can look at it from. So the temple as an embodiment of the creation. So day 1 of the creation, the heavens are stretched out like a curtain. And here we have the symbolism, the tent of the tabernacle, the stretching of the tent over the poles, kind of a thing. Day 2, firmament is representative of the temple veil. Day 3, the waters below the firmament is representative of the laver, of the bronze sea. Day 4, the lights represents the menorah, the light stand. Day 5, the birds, the winged cherubim that are embroidered upon the veils. Day 6, man, and that is the creation of the high priest, Aaron, that officiates in the tabernacle. And then day 7, we have the cessation of work, the blessing and the completion of it. And likewise, the tabernacle and its dedication. So, taking that, putting it aside, looking at the tabernacle in a new light, tabernacle is a recreation of the path of Eden. So we have the creation, the garden, and then Adam and Eve's fall out of the garden, and then the atonement through the temple, bringing us back into the presence of God. So it's the path of Eden, out and back in. Setting that aside, moving on to a new paradigm. So the tabernacle as a replication of Mount Sinai. So I took the tabernacle diagram and put it upward so that the presence of God was the highest, and like Sinai. So we have the presence of God where Moses was. He was the only one allowed there. It's very restricted access. Likewise, the Holy of Holies is restricted access, and it's restricted by that cloud, the veil. We do have the representatives of Israel, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and 70 elders that were allowed to go partway up the mountain. They weren't able to penetrate the cloud, but they were able to go up partway up the mountain. That represents the holy place of the tabernacle, where the showbread, the menorah, and the incense altar are. And then they have a ritual meal of bread and wine there. Just like in the tabernacle, you have the showbread and the wine. It's a sacramental table. And then you have the congregation of Israel down at the base of the mountain. They're not allowed to go up or into the presence of God, but they are to be sacrificing and washing themselves, making themselves pure, and yet they build a golden calf. Now, we'll talk about this later, but the symbolism is that they're supposed to be doing the right sacrifice at the right time in the right place, but they're not. They're not doing the sacrifice of the red heifer and washing themselves, becoming clean. They are building they're not sacrificing a red heifer, they're building a golden calf. Very different things. It's very much the story of Cain. The wrong sacrifice at the wrong time in the wrong place. And then there at the bottom, Exodus 25:40, it paraphrasing says, "Now this pattern that you've seen on Sinai, go and recreate a temple, go recreate this experience so that you can do this often." Now, it's important in order to understand the temple, tripping over my words. In order to understand the temple, we need to understand the priesthood personnel that acted within the temple. So Kohen is the name for priest in Hebrew, and if we remember the im, I-M, at the end of a Hebrew word makes it plural. So here we have priests, the Kohenim. And we'll see that a lot if you study the Temple Institute that is currently rebuilding the temple over in Jerusalem. And trying to do the sacrifices, reinstitute all of those things. They're called the Kohenim. So it basically represents all of the priests. So here we have kind of a bubble Venn diagram thing of the Levites versus the priests versus the high priests. Now, the tribe of Levi were the priestly people, right? But not all Levites are priests, and not all priests are high priests. But all high priests are Levites, and so forth. I mean, so that's why the bubbles are fitting within each other. So anybody from the tribe of Levi are considered the Levites, and they can go in lots of different places. I have a slide on it in a bit, where exactly they resided. But the priests, they're from the tribe of Levi, but they also have an additional qualification, which is that they are descendants of Aaron. And then the high priests, there's only one high priest at a time, and so there's an additional specification. It has to be a descendant of Aaron's firstborn son after the birthright. So here's just a kind of a simplified picture of what those different types of priests wore. They had different clothing, and if we had a whole class, a whole semester long just on the Kohenim, we'd dive into these a lot more and everything. But suffice it to say, they're very different. So Levites, these are the ones that sung the psalms during the temple services. They performed construction and maintenance for the temple. Not only the temple of the temple of Solomon there in Jerusalem, but other temples throughout the land. They served as guards. They served as teachers and judges. Anytime somebody had needed taught in a synagogue about the things, those were the Levites' duty. And then they maintained cities of refuge within each tribe. So here's a map of the land inheritances of each of the tribes. Now you'll notice that Levi doesn't have one. It's because the Levites were to be split amongst all of them. They were the official representative of God within each tribe. So they had cities of refuge within each tribe, and that's where all of the tribe of Levi, that was their duty to do that. So moving on to the priests, so that they had to be descendants of Aaron and of the tribe of Levi. Now these are the ones that actually officiated in the temple sacrifices and rituals. You would take your animals to them. You would slaughter them, and then they would put the pieces of the sacrifice upon the altar and so forth. They represented Christ as a mediator, and they collected the tithes. They blew the trumpet on festive occasions. They communicated the law and the ritual purity to the people. So if there was ever a question if you were ritually impure, you would go to them to verify and ask and everything. So during, especially like Solomon's time and those early ones, there are lots of Levites, and there are lots of priests, especially when you get to the time of Christ. There's tons of priests, descendants of Aaron, and we see that in the time of Christ, that there's 24 Kohanic divisions. So they've split the priest quorum into 24 different divisions because there's so many of them, and they all want to officiate in the temple because that's a high honor. And so here's where you see Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist. He was only allowed to, or it was not only allowed, he got the privilege of doing it once in his lifetime, to go and into the holy place, not the Holy of Holies, into the holy place at the incense altar and pray in behalf of the people, kind of thing. And that's where Gabriel came to him and closed his mouth and stuff like that. So he's a priest, not a high priest, and Zechariah is not a high priest that gets to go into the Holy of Holies. That's a common misconception. So he is one of the priests. He's a descendant of Aaron. Look at the story and you'll see his lineage there. And yeah, so they're not allowed into the holy place, into the Holy of Holies. They are allowed into the holy place. Then moving on to high priests. So they had to be descendants of Aaron's firstborn. They wore the Urim and Thummim, along with the breastplate that had like the 12 gemstones, the 12 tribes on it. They performed oracular duties, meaning they prophesied, saw into the future, oracles, stuff like that. Their most important function was on the Day of Atonement. So go back to the video on the festivals, the feasts and festivals, and we'll see a lot about that. The Day of Atonement, this is when the two goats were brought in. One was to represent Christ, one was to represent Satan. The sacrificial goat for Christ was slain, and then all of the sins of the people were put upon the goat Azazel for Satan, and then cast out of the camp. So the high priest was the only one that was allowed to do things for Israel as a whole. So he put all of their collective sins put his hands upon Azazel's head and put all of their sins upon it, and then cast those sins out of the crowd, out of the camp of Israel. And then he was the one that did the daily meal sacrifice, and he's the only one that is allowed into the Holy of Holies. So after the two goats and the scapegoat and all of that, he alone goes into the Holy of Holies and receives communication directly from the Lord. He's in the presence of God, and then comes back out to the camp of Israel, raises his hands high above his head, and proclaims that blessing that was just given to him onto the camp of Israel, as if he were putting his hands on all their heads. But he's doing it on all of Israel as a whole. So he would receive the blessing and then pronounce it upon their head. It's kind of like almost a patriarchal blessing each year kind of a thing. But that only happened once a year on the Day of Atonement. So the congregation had to get all of their sins removed and send that goat out, and then go into the Holy of Holies, receive the blessing, come back out. So one tradition or lore, I guess you would say, is that the high priest could technically wither in the presence of God if he was not holy enough to be in his presence. And so legend has it that they would tie a rope around his ankle so that if he did drop dead in the Holy of Holies, that he could be dragged out and send a new high priest in, his son, kind of a thing. Who knows if that's real or not, but that is what is claimed in different Christian and Jewish circles. I think it's just an interesting little tidbit of history there. So that chart at the bottom, the high priests from Exodus to Solomon's temple, is very interesting, but it's kind of a snooze fest if you don't know who these people are. I'm going to go through it really quick. So Aaron is the first high priest, and then the high priesthoodship is passed on to Eleazar. Remember, there's only one high priest at a time. It's passed on to Eleazar. And Eleazar is not his first son, but it is his birthright son, because the other two first sons were killed because they didn't perform their priestly duties correctly, and God struck them down. So Eleazar is the birthright son that gets it, and he passes it on to Phinehas. But between there, Phinehas somehow go through this whole thing again. All right, so this chart at the bottom is kind of a snooze fest, but I find it very interesting. Here's kind of the history of the high priests from Exodus to Solomon's temple. So we have Aaron, who's the first high priest. His first son is not Eleazar, But his first two sons are struck down because they did not perform their priesthood duties correctly. They were kind of in that Cain category of wrong sacrifice, making a mockery of it, kind of a thing. So they were struck down, killed, and Eleazar takes his place as the birthright son. So Aaron passes his high priesthoodship on to Eleazar. Remember, there's only one high priest at a time. Passes it on to Eleazar, who passes it on to his son Phinehas. But in that transition there, Phinehas does not pass it on to his son. It goes back over to Aaron's other son, Ithamar's descendant, who is Eli. And then it goes Eli to Ahitub, to Ahijah, to Ahimelech, to Abiathar. Now, Abiathar was not respected by Solomon, and so Solomon put it back to Eleazar's lineage, to Zadok, and that's where like the Zadokites come from. Random tidbit of story. If we had a whole semester, I'd definitely go into all of that and all the intricacies. But moving on. So here we have to kind of step back. This class is about how the tabernacle is a pattern of redemption. So we just talked about the people within it. There's certain Levites, priests, and high priests, all performing different functions. They can go into different parts of it, and how they represent mediators along the covenant path back to the presence of God. So, moving on to the camp of Israel. So this is a good graphic, but it's not all-inclusive. It's not my favorite, but it does kind of show how the tents and tribes would have kind of been situated. So note that this one is a little different because east is downward, west is up. So the next slide that I'm going to show has it rotated so that north is up. So keep that in mind as we're rotating this. So here's the camp of Israel, and you have the 12 tribes around the side, except for Levi is not a tribe. He does not have a land inheritance necessarily yet. This is how they were camping with the portable tabernacle. Keep that in mind. This is not like Solomon's temple. The portable tabernacle, they each have a land inheritance where they're supposed to be camping. So you have 3 on each of the 4 sides to equal the 12, except Levi does not have that position. So Joseph's tribe is split into Ephraim and Manasseh. They're on the west. All right, so there is one tribe on each side that's in charge of the other 2. So Dan, Judah, Reuben, and Ephraim are kind of the heads of the household on each side. And they take care of those things. But inward, we do have Levi. His 3 sons are camped in 3 different locations. So the sons of Merari, the sons of Gershon, and Kohath are all on different sides. And then over on Judah's side, we have the camp where Moses, Aaron, and his sons camped. Kind of the high priests and priests there. Versus all of the tribes of Levi that were on the other sides. And then you have the Mifkot altar. This is a good representation of it, where it is 2,000 cubits outside the camp. It's nowhere close to the tabernacle. So there's sacrifices on the brazen altar, the incense altar, the mercy seat, all of that kind of stuff. But here we have the sacrifice of the red heifer is way out there, way out past the camp of Judah. All right. And I think it's an interesting tidbit. Notice where each of these tribes end up in modern times. So the camp of Ephraim, who's Ephraim? It's kind of the Gentile nations. We have the Americas, Ephraim, Manasseh, Benjamin. We're over here in the west. The camp of Dan, Asher, Naphtali, those are the lost tribes. They get taken and scattered. The camp of Judah stays in Jerusalem. Issachar and Zebulun are kind of in those lost tribes, but basically the camp of Judah stays there in the Middle East. Reuben, it's kind of said that he goes southward Anyway, just interesting kind of how that plays out in modern times versus how they were set up in the camp there in the wilderness. All right, so we have the tabernacle. Now we're going to transition to Solomon's temple and how it's significant. So the portable tabernacle, even once they get into the promised land, it moves around from city to city a lot, depending on battles and different things that they're doing. So the tabernacle kind of rests at Shiloh, but the capital is in Jerusalem. So we know David's story, Solomon's story, and how David wants to build the temple, but it's Solomon, his son, who actually completes it because David is unworthy. Little do we know that Solomon ends up being a wicked man at the end of his life too. But this is just about the temples. So it takes 7 years to construct, and you can read all about its construction and all the ornateness and huge aspects of it, the grandeur. And it takes 7 days to create it or dedicate it. Anytime we're talking about creation, we're not talking about construction. Creation is only the dedication part of it, where it receives its name and function. Likewise, in the days of creation, the things aren't constructed, but it takes 7 days to create them or dedicate them, giving them a name and a function. I really want to get into that, but it'll be in a future class. But there's a huge difference between construction and creation, or dedication. And so with Solomon's temple, once it's built, the whole of Israel is to make pilgrimage to it 3 times a year: Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. So those are very much the census times when people are come and counted. They are numbered at Golgotha. It's the place of numbering where you count the heads of people, not dead. Golgotha gets a modern, weird, twisted rap for being the place of the dead skull, and it's not that. It's very much the place of numbering. Anyway, side tangent. Anyway, so you make pilgrimage to the temple, Passover, Pentecost, and Feast of Tabernacles, but there are kind of mini temples throughout all of the land. In each of the tribes' land, you have different ones, like the one at Bethel is the big one up for the northern tribes and stuff like that eventually. But everyone's supposed to come to this central temple 3 times a year. So we have the outer courtyard that has music and sacrifice and washings. It had the brazen laver and the brazen altar. Then in the holy place, as we're going inward, there's the meals. That's where the priests would eat. The incense altar, the prayers for the people, the priestly blessing was there. It had the incense altar, the showbread table, but it did not have the menorah. The menorah was in the Holy of Holies in Solomon's temple. So we have the oracles. In the Holy of Holies, the Moses or the high priest would go in and receive the oracles, the thus saith the Lord, proclamations, prophecies. The atonements for the people were made in the Holy of Holies. And it contained the Ark of the Covenant and the menorah. And it had the golden glistening walls that looked like fire when the light would pass through the veil, and it would glisten as if you're in the presence of deity, in the presence of fire all the time. The menorah was Holy Mother Wisdom within the holy place. It's very interesting. This is kind of a side tangent again. Sorry, but in the Holy of Holies, you have both male and female presence, and the menorah was the female presence of deity, Holy Mother Wisdom, in the Holy of Holies. And we'll see where that's taken out and put into the other place here in a bit. But the Solomon's temple lasted about 414 years approximately. I mean, there's lots of different speculations and differences in the exact years. But take a look at the 400. The United States has been around for 400 years, from 1620 to 2020. Just in a comparison as far as how long Solomon's temple was functioning, kind of a thing, versus the portable tabernacle. I mean, it's a pretty short lifespan versus Solomon's temple. All right, moving on. This is still during Solomon's temple. Still, after Solomon introduces pagan worship and with Baal and Ashtoreth and all of the pagan gods, I mean, just absolute wickedness. The tribes split. So the northern 10 tribes split off from the southern 2 tribes. And here's a list of the kings of those respectively. Now, they are not lined up exactly like, for example, the last ones, Hoshea and Jehoiachin. They were not at the exact same time. This is just their order of appearance is all. I'm not trying to equate them at during timelines kind of here. But this is just a list of the 20 kings of Judah and the 19 kings of the northern tribes of Israel. The color is the most important part here. Red is a wicked king, and green is a righteous king. Now, when I say righteous, it doesn't mean that they did everything correctly, but they at least had righteous intents. So we're going to be talking a lot about the last green one, Josiah, because he is the one that changed the temple quite a bit. So we have lots of apostasy happening throughout the legacy of Solomon's temple. So if you look at the United States, I think it's an interesting comparison. So 400 years. A lot can happen in 400 years. You have good, we have bad, we have fluctuations all over the thing. We have the Civil War, we have things getting split, lots of different stuff. But we do have people that are trying to do good throughout time, but sometimes they change things and go overzealous on others. So that's where Josiah, this last green righteous king, comes in of the southern tribes. So he's appointed when he's 8 years old. He kind of grows up in that kingly responsibility. He's influenced by the prophets Jeremiah, the prophetess Huldah, and the prophet Zephaniah. But he wants to do good, but he wasn't raised correctly. He didn't know the scriptures and stuff. He, in the temple, he found the temple scrolls, the law of Moses, and it was an awakening to him. He had never heard those things before. So he goes through and destroys the altars of Baal, the Baalist altars. He throws down the child sacrifices. These are good things. He's purging Israel of these bad things that Solomon introduced, and those things were perpetuated throughout those 400 years. But he did remove the menorah from the Holy of Holies and put it into the holy place, but not the Holy of Holies. So he removed Holy Mother Wisdom from any kind of thing because he thought that was a blasphemy, that there was only one deity and it was male, kind of a thing. That very unfortunate, but he did a lot of other good things. But overzealous, he kind of did a naughty. Anyway, so he destroyed all of the other temples, especially the one up in Bethel in the northern tribes, and said that it was paganistic worship and everything. Side note, Bethel, Beth is house of, and El is God. So Bethel is the house of God. I mean, they had a sanctioned temple up there, but he destroyed it and centralized all worship to Jerusalem's temple. Now, everybody had to come to Jerusalem to get sanctified, to do sin sacrifices and trespass offerings and things like that. And long story short, after Josiah, there's 4 different kings. Right before Zedekiah, though, the Jehoiachin, the prophet Jeremiah cursed him and all of his posterity that they would never rule Israel again. They would never sit as kings. And we'll see that come back here in a bit. I'll come back to this chart when we reference it. But that Jehoiachin, just a dirty guy. All right, so the Babylonians come in and tear the temple, destroy everything, take the holy artifacts out, and those are just, complete destruction. But they had it coming. So we have the Babylonian exile, which lasts for 70 or so years, and then we have Nebuchadnezzar's dream. We have Cyrus, who is raised up by the Lord to bring them back, allow them to come back. And so Cyrus has his dream and his come to Jesus moment where he allows them to come back and worship their true God. But he only does it if Zerubbabel is governor. So Zerubbabel is Jehoiachin's posterity. He's his grandson. So this chart here, Jehoiachin, remember Jeremiah cursed them so that they would not have kingship. But this Zerubbabel is not put in as king. He's just a governor so that they can kind of skirt around that issue. So Zerubbabel and Joshua come back and kind of rule, but it is a diarchy where there's a prince and a high priest, both ruling in different ways. So it's kind of the same principle. The house divided itself cannot stand. And God does not like this. He does not sanction another temple. But Zerubbabel and Joshua help facilitate the return of the temple treasures. The altars rebuilt, sacrifices are resumed, and they begin rebuilding the temple without God's permission. It is dedicated in 516 BC, but it doesn't have the Ark of the Covenant. That was lost. It does not have the Shekinah, the holy presence of God in it. It does not have the Urim and Thummim. They cannot perform oracles. Anytime that they call down fire to consume the sacrifices upon the altar, no fire comes, and there is not the spirit of prophecy. So as a model of redemption, what's missing here? We do not have the right sacrifice at the right time, at the right place, the right person. God is not entering in. This temple is not sanctioned. But we do have Zerubbabel's temple that lasts about 479 years. So it's another whole period, just kind of like the United States, America. We have about 400, 500 years here. It lasts a long time, and they're doing these things for quite a while. But it's not without its labor pains and growing pains. So after the Babylonian conquest, we have the Persian conquests, and then the Greek conquests. So the Greeks take over the Persian Empire, and Antiochus Epiphanes, he comes in and desecrates the temple in 168 BC. So this is the abomination of desolation in that day. And he comes in and offers swine, unclean animals upon the altar, sets his own image up in the temple. It's bad. And so that puts into place or starts the wheels in motion for the Maccabean revolts. And those happen for a 7-year period by the 5 sons of Mattathias, I believe it's pronounced. I don't know. I could be wrong on that one. But it's the Maccabean family, the Maccabeans. So the main son is Judas Maccabeus. And he cleanses the temple and restores parts of it. But it's not sanctioned. There's no sense in doing it. But Judas Maccabeus' brother Simon does establish the Hasmonean Dynasty from 140 to 116 BC, and they try to start things back up. But these Greeks are just the Hellenization of the people is a real down point of their whole history. How can we still be pure, but yet participate with the Greeks in their games and in their daily lifestyle and things like that. So this is where the whole period of time, I mean, this is, 400, 500 year long time, where there's a real division amongst all of the people. You have the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, the Zadokites, the Essenes, all of these people are just splitting up in all of the different ways of interpreting the law. And it's because they didn't have a temple that was sanctioned of the Lord. They weren't offering the right sacrifice at the right time in the right place so that God could enter in and be the right person. They were trying to do things on their own. And when that happens, division happens. So this Zerubbabel's temple lasts until 37 BC when Herod takes over. And I find that one of the best resources on this is the Bible dictionary, Temple of Zerubbabel. Go and look at it. It's an amazing resource. So here's a development of the Temple Mount. Now, this is the traditional location. So like Wailing Wall, where it's currently at, we're basing it off of that. And I'll talk about the difference in opinions a little bit later on. But this is a good chart to kind of look at the framework. So the yellow part there is the original Solomon's Temple structure fortification. And then during the Hasmonean period, the Temple of Zerubbabel does do a little bit of an extension there, the red orangish part there. And then when Herod comes around, he just blows everything out of the water. I mean, he expands, fortifies, and that green section is just massive. It really makes the Temple Mount a huge place. So Herod was the father of an Edomite. So it's not a tribe of Israel, but we have the Edomites, and his ancestors did convert to Judaism, but they're not Israelites. He was appointed and everything with the Romans. So we're moving on from the Greek Hellenization to the Roman period. And he so desperately wanted to be accepted by the Jews as a legitimate heir to the throne. He thought he was the prophesied person to come and build up Jerusalem, the great builder. As a person of Israel, he was technically baptized. He was part of the covenant, but nobody accepted him. He was an outsider. He just wanted so bad to have the Jews look at him as legitimate that he turned into a zealous builder of everything. We have Herodium, the city, Bethlehem, Jericho, everything. He's just building like crazy in order to be accepted by the Jews. So one of his deals with the Jews was that he would use Zerubbabel's original structure, but rework it, remodel it, because they did not want the Zerubbabel temple being torn down. So they kind of struck a deal that he would use the same building materials, but organize it in a better way, kind of a thing. Anyway, so a lot of times you'll hear about the third temple that is going to be built before the Savior comes, but it's actually the fifth temple. And it's so confusing, but here's the point. So we're not regarding Moses' tabernacle as a temple, even though it technically was the same function, but they're calling Solomon's temple the first temple. And then the second temple is both Zerubbabel and Herod's temple put together. Since it's made out of the same building materials, it's technically all together in one, and it's deemed the second temple. So from 516 to 70 AD, that's what is termed the second temple, even though they're two very distinct, very separate temples. And then the third temple would be the future temple that they build. Even though we know from this presentation, there's 4 different tabernacle temples, and the fifth one is what's going to be before Christ comes. Anyway, that's just kind of trying to explain that in such a short amount of time that it needs more, but there it is. So Herod's temple there is nothing in the Holy of Holies. He does rebuild menorah, showbread, incense altar. He has to rebuild all of those things. But again, one of the best resources is the Bible Dictionary, Temple of Herod. But look at how many years that this one approximately lasts. It's only about 87 years. I mean, it's a very short time frame. So it's kind of like the biggest topples first. The small and simple lasts the longest kind of thing. Very interesting principles. But as a model of redemption, what's missing? They're not doing the right sacrifice at the right time at the right place so that God can enter in. This temple is not sanctioned by God. But it begs the question, then why did Christ go in it and claim that it was his Father's house first, and then later on when he cleanses it again, he claims it as his own house? The thought behind it is still the house of the Lord, even though God's presence, his Shekinah, is not there. It's still his house. It was built to him, but are the sacrifices because of the idolatry of the people ordained of God? No. But it is still his house. There's a lot of interesting dichotomy there. But moving on. I get distracted so often, sorry. All right. So this is a depiction by Ernest Martin. And this is kind of the way that the scholarly debate is heading, that the traditional Dome of the Rock location is not the temple. It is the Antonia Fortress. So I'm presenting both. Don't get me wrong. But, I mean, if you ask me, this one's totally correct. So we'll get into this heavily next time with the red heifer, because the red heifer really proves that this is the true layout of the Temple Mount. But in a nutshell, we have the Temple Mount that's up in the upper right-hand corner there, the traditional Temple Mount, the Dome of the Rock, up there. That's where the temple traditionally is said to be at. But in this location debate, the temple is down in the city of David. So it's in the bottom left-hand corner over here. The Antonia Fortress was what was built up, and that's what the western wall that they're wailing at. That's actually the Roman fortificated where all the soldiers lived and slept and ate and everything. All right. So here's kind of a look at the actual city. It's a little bit easier to see. So the traditional temple location up there, but the city of David is that lower part. So it's kind of in like two little, if you make two fists, it's in the lower fist down here. They're kind of like two little Vesica Pisces. The city of David is the original city that David built, little tiny up here, and then it expands northward and gets more gates and more fortification around it. But it's the city of David where this debate points that the temple was actually at. This is where the Gihon Spring is and Hezekiah's Tunnel, all that kind of stuff. Down here in the city of David, not the traditional Temple Mount location. A side note, it's not that I'm sponsoring his website, but archaeologyillustrated.com is a huge resource for tons of images. You can see the city of David from different angles and through different periods of time. It is, I mean, they do lots of different cities. It's not just Jerusalem, but I mean, if you want some Bible images, go to archaeologyillustrated.com. Best resource, hands down. Now, our archaeology is always changing as we're finding new information and everything. Like, some of the things, opinions change over time, but he's depicted a lot of stuff as we know it today. Is it all totally 100% correct? Time will tell. But if you want some images to understand the Bible, that's it. All right, so last slide. But here is a view of this same location debate, but looking from the Mifkad altar on the Mount of Olives towards the temple. So I've tried to keep the temple in the same exact location. So the temple is in the city of David, there in the upper left-hand corner. And the Mifkad altar is in the foreground here. And so we're across the Kidron Valley. That bridge crosses the Kidron Valley. And you have on the Mount of Olives, the Mifkad altar where we sacrifice the red heifer. Like I said, we're going to be getting into this in the future. But this class was about the 4 different temples, tabernacles. Let's go back to that to tie it all together. So we have the 4 temples of Jerusalem, and they're all a model of redemption back into the presence of God. The Tabernacle of Moses and Solomon's temple were the only ones sanctioned by God. They're the only ones that had the Shekinah, the holy presence, glory of God within them, the fire that would come down and consume the sacrifices. Zerubbabel's temple, definitely not sanctioned. Herod's temple, definitely not sanctioned of God. But all are still patterns of the way of redemption. And if we look at our triad, the right place at the right time with the right sacrifice, then God can enter in and we take up our rest in him. And so hopefully that was helpful with a quick primer on the temples of Jerusalem. Next week we will be getting into the red heifer finally. It's such a mysterious offering that we just don't know anything about, but we're going to be looking at the scriptures and patterns and everything that's there to be learned from it, and pointing towards our modern day as we're raising up a red heifer in order to offer again in righteousness a sacrifice unto the Lord, where the Lord can drink of the wine of the vineyard again. All right, have a great week.